Hi there again. Welcome to Unit 3. We're trucking right through the semester here, and Unit 3 focuses on feedstuffs that we're going to use in livestock diets out there. So, again, we're going to start to dive deeper and deeper into what's available to feed and why we might feed it, what purpose it serves, even start to begin talking about some economics of feeding, how things are processed and milled, and just kind of get into some good discussions about why it is we do what we do out there in the nutritional programming of these. Let's get into the objectives here, and again, I'm not going to read them for you. You can jump through them yourself and talk about think about some of this stuff and get focused on what we're going to get to here through this section. But again, we're building up quite carefully to starting to do some diet formulation actually on our own here in the classroom. When we talk about feeds, there's essentially 8 classes, and we group them by origin and like characteristics of feeds. The first one we'll jump into and talk about is dry roughages and forages, and so that's basically anything that is cut and then cured. So anything that contains crude fiber greater than 18%. Generally, when we talk about crude fiber or dry roughages, dry forages, things like straw and hay, they're generally low in net energy. So you're not going to pick alfalfa hay to improve your energy profile of your ration. It's just not going to work. You're not going to feed straw in order to get more energy into your cattle. It just won't work. So carbonaceous roughages, things like straw, generally again very low in protein, very high in crude. Corn stalks, you might see during the wintertime some beef cattle, brood cows out there on corn stalks. They actually are quite good at converting that. But is it the highest quality feed? Certainly not. Economical, you bet, because it's not doesn't cost you much of anything to have cattle out there consuming the leftovers after the combine's been through the field. We can also subcategorize then the proteinaceous roughages, which is like the legume hays or grass hays or legume grass mixture that I was just referring to, and types of hays that would be out there. So that's the first one that's out there. It would be dry forages and roughages. Next is pasture, range feeds, and what we call fresh fed or green chop feeds. Pasture grass, this is anything that's not allowed to ferment before you feed it. What they that gets kind of its own category because most of the time it's quite variable in terms of a nutrient profile. It changes, and you can't feed it often through the year. Obviously, pasture available in southern Illinois through the spring, summer, and fall for most of us, and a few that are very intensive and good at grazing might get a few more months than that. But here we're talking about the feed's not allowed to ferment or dry in any way. The next one, as we pulled up the slide here, is anything that would be called a silage, anything an ensiled forage. And we can subcategorize those as carbonaceous or proteinaceous. Obviously, anything carbonaceous would be high in carbohydrates, like corn silage that would include a lot of grain, hopefully grain content in that corn silage. Grass silage would go as a carbonaceous silage. Wheat silage would go in that category as well as carbonaceous silages. Proteinaceous silages then ensiled feeds like alfalfa or clover silage that you cut and then chop wet, blow it up there in that silo or put it in the bag or make baleage out of it and let that feed ferment in that way. All ensiled feeds. So those are all going to be things that are important in terms of how you store them. Will really, when you cut or chop, and then how you store them really will dictate the quality of the feed that forages. Energy feeds are next. Energy feeds, by definition, have less than 20% crude protein and less than 18% crude fiber. Now, what's tricky is you might find some of these things ensiled. Now, don't get confused into thinking that corn silage fits into this category because generally corn silage has more than 18% crude fiber. So when I say this might be ensiled, we're generally talking about something like high moisture corn here. Carbonaceous concentrates are things like all your cereal grains, corn and wheat and sorghum, and Milo would go in this category, and even some byproduct feeds like wheat bran or wheat middlings or corn cobs might fit in this energy feed. Even molasses, either in the dry or wet form, fits in this energy feeds category. Protein supplements then come in next, and what makes them unique is obviously they're all going to be by definition greater than 20% crude protein. So, if you know a little bit about corn and its profile, corn is 9% protein. So, you would not feed corn in order to increase your protein in your feed ration. You would pick something like soybean meal that's 48% crude protein. So protein supplements are going to be either vegetable or animal in origin. So your vegetable origin examples are clearly soybean meal, which would be the number one protein supplement feed, coupled with the number one energy feed, which is corn, the basis of most of your swine rations out there. Some more examples as you see them here is cottonseed meal, corn gluten meal, brewers' dried grains that you might find byproducts of other processing industries. There's also some animal origin feeds out there like meat and bone meal or blood meal, and you'll find some restrictions or bans on how those might be used in livestock diets today, and most of that relates back to mad cow disease and making sure that we restrict the spread of any of those health issues as those are related. Really, the main difference in why you might pick a vegetable origin versus an animal origin protein supplement is differences in amino acid profile. All vegetable protein origin feeds have a much different amino acid grouping than animal origin feeds. So it's important most of the time, if you want to maximize productivity, to have a blend of both of them and understand that each one brings a very different amino acid profile. Different in terms of digestibility, different in terms of amino acids, and they're also, of course, different in terms of cost. Some other things that might fit into that animal product or animal protein category, things like fish meal. If you've ever smelled fish meal, it's very distinct, obviously. Or milk products like whey protein is mixed into a lot of your swine, baby, pig feeds, or even feather meal or a blend of what we call fish and feather meal that's not listed here on the slide. But those would all be protein supplements. Next category as we move along through the eight that we talk about are mineral supplements, and I'll just give you a couple like calcium carbonate or regular ground limestone would be examples of mineral supplements. Now, are you going to pick up some minerals out of your alfalfa hay? For sure. Or is there minerals in your corn silage? Absolutely. Are there mineral content in soybean meal? Absolutely. Do any of them have enough to match an animal's nutritional need? Most of the time not. That's why we need to think about supplementing your ration something that carries the mineral content in order to have you know, proper reproductive function animals that are healthy and ready to produce for you out there. Next is vitamin supplement. I don't have very many things on here. Fish oil provides a lot of different vitamin profile. There's many others that we'll discuss later on, but generally you buy a mineral vitamin package and you'll get both of those together, and so you don't have to, as a producer out there, hopefully you have a good quality feed nutrition professional helping you balance these diets that will put the proper things in. But there are products like vitamin ADE complex. We'll use that whenever we start doing some actual ration balancing later on. And then I believe lastly is a category kind of all of its own, and we'll study these more later on in terms of feed additives. Things like propylene glycol. Propylene glycol is used in order to help provide a little bit of extra sugar to animals that maybe aren't getting enough energy in their diet. It's essentially like a sugar water, so to speak. Titanium dioxide is a coloring agent, or you might find something like sodium bentonite that's not on here that obviously would also, when you talk about sodium as a mineral, but sodium bentonite lots of times is used as an additive to bind up any toxins that might exist in your feed and keep your animals a little bit more healthy. So it's used as an additive. To kind of wrap up before we talk about international feed names here, to kind of put a bow on those 8 things that we talked about and why they're different, is again, understand as we begin to build diets why we pick certain feeds and what purpose will they serve. Again, if you want to be economical, you do not want to feed soybean meal in order to increase the energy profile of your ration. It's too expensive. You don't want to feed corn in order to improve the protein profile of your ration. You can't feed enough to make it go high enough most of the time, and then you'll run into other issues. It's important that you understand which category of feeds to select from as you begin to build your ration, and which feeds will provide what type of performance in the diet. Just a real quick slide here on international feed names. It's kind of the common language, and I put this slide in here just real quickly because as you get into your textbook and we start building rations, you'll find some things referred to differently that we call, for example, in the United States, we call corn corn, and everywhere else in the world it's referred to as maize, and in your book it's going to be referred to as maize. So that's an international feed name that's used by everybody, and there are lots of different facets to that naming process. But as we start to begin to select feeds and build our own diets out there and some of the activities that we're going to do in class, understand that they may sound weird to you, but it's an international feed name, so that everyone that does this stuff on the research basis is talking about this. So when we looked at characteristics of concentrate feedstuffs, carbonaceous concentrates, we get into this a little bit deeper here, talking about feeds that are a little bit maybe lower in crude protein and also lower in fiber, but generally these are your high. Obviously, we're talking about corn, and it's going to be high in energy, low in fiber, generally low in protein, low in protein quality, and sometimes high in variability. So here's some examples. We're going to start showing you some examples here of different feeds, and I want you to kind of take note, maybe highlight as you go along here, what feeds some of these nutrient profiles look like. So we've already referred to corn a few times, but corn has about 80% TDN, or total digestible nutrients, as we talked about in the last section. It also only has about 8 to 9% crude protein, and pretty much it doesn't matter what brand of corn, what variety of corn, what day length of corn that you grow out there. If we sample corn all over the country, it almost always comes in between 8 and 9% crude protein. You will not often find corn that will test and come in, let's say 13% crude protein, unless it's been treated with something, or come in at 6% crude protein. Almost always corn is corn is corn when it comes to crude protein. Corn is generally pretty low in calcium and a little bit in the medium category in phosphorus, and there's some technologies listed there that come and go in terms of other uses, and we'll talk about that in discussion. Alternative feeding forms of corn, we can certainly grind it, and we'll talk about that more later. We can steam flake it, you could pellet it, you could process it, crack it. There's a number of different ways to feed corn, and that's certainly important on how we maximize the efficiency of the energy that's in it. Also in this category is oats, 65 to 70% TDN and 12% crude protein. So, as you compare it to corn, it certainly doesn't have quite the energy impact, but it does provide a little bit more protein. Oats a very palatable feed, but clearly more expensive. There's just not as much grown out there, so it is more costly to feed, but you won't find very many animals. And obviously, we say where is it most commonly used? The equine industry feeds probably the bulk of the oats out there, because about 12% will catch most equine rations in terms of crude protein feeding needs. Another example of a feed that might fit in this category is dried beet pulp. Again, you can kind of read through its profile there. This is a byproduct of the sugar beet processing industry. Provides about 18% crude fiber, so you do get a little fiber impact kind of right at the top of the energy feed carbonaceous concentrate feeds, but it might be something to consider. Most will use this only at specialized times or in specialized feeds, because this one gets a little bit expensive and again is seasonal availability in many ways. Also a byproduct of the same industry is molasses. Same kind of energy profile, really low in crude protein, and most of that is urea that comes with your molasses. But I say ask a couple questions there in terms of it's usually fed in what form, and that would be liquid. You can get it in the dry form, but it's most often used in the liquid form. And advantages of feeding is it will make almost anything taste good. And those of you who like chocolate sauce on your ice cream out there know what I'm talking about. Or the reason that you put ranch on your salad is it makes it more palatable, and that's exactly why we feed molasses, is to hide the bad taste of some of the other feeds that we might prefer to feed. Animal fat goes in this category. Again, byproduct of the rendering business. We talked about those of you who are in animal sciences class. We treat it with an antioxidant in order to prevent rancidity. And rancidity means it rots and goes bad in the tank out there. The question is posed there, why do we feed it? Well, we feed it because it provides a big energy impact. Remember that fats are 2.25 times more energy dense than the same pound of carbohydrate, so sometimes we just need some little fat in the diet to provide an energy bump. Plus, remember, animals have a fat or lipid requirement. In ruminant diets, you can maximize fat feeding at about 5% of the diet. You can't really go above that, or you will suffer some health effects. We'll get in and discuss that in class. Non-ruminants, and I'm talking about pigs here primarily, 10% gets way up there in terms of how much fat that you can feed. And I'll tell you from previous class experience, when we start building rations, some of you will really start to cheat, and you'll feed 20 and 30% fat in your diet, and that would be like soup to your pig, and they might eat it for a while, but then it's going to provide them a stomach ache, and it just won't work. Plus, when you get up into that 7 or 8% of the diet in fat, that feed gets really sticky and doesn't flow through some of our systems the way that we might like. The next product there, dried bakery product. I say, what might this include? And I've seen this product a number of times. Sometimes it's donuts and Pop-Tarts, things of that nature that maybe didn't make the cut or weren't mixed quite properly, or maybe went out of condition on the store shelves and they're returned. And those companies that, like Hostess, that makes all those donuts, then makes those available for sale at a discounted rate. And some of you might be able to get your hands on something like that because it does have a similar energy profile to corn. It is higher in fat and it is higher in salt. So you have to be careful if you get dried bakery product or some of those byproduct feeds like that, and put them in your ration. Personally, I saw it wasn't a dry product; it was a wet product delivered to a farm one time, and it had mainly it was donuts and pies and things of that nature that had gone out of condition or were not mixed properly to the proper recipe and made mistakes, and the guy got a big semi-load in it, and he fed that in his ration all the time, actually got a great price on it and replaced corn. All right, so let's transition and talk about some of the protein feeds that we have out there, and we certainly talk about quality. There's a lot of differences in protein quality depending on your feeds. Remember, I provide you that acronym again, Private Tim Hall, and think about the essential amino acids that we have to supplement in there to that diet, and also whether we need to use NPN in ruminants to cheapen the cost and provide a little bit of soluble protein to the ruminant. So let's get in and talk about some proteinaceous concentrate. So urea, we've been referring to that as your NPN source. It's 281% or 282% crude protein. So you're only going to use a little dab of it. And by little dab, I'm talking about maybe 2/10 of a pound is about all you would feed per head per day in terms of using urea. That's about all that's effective. The rumen bacteria love urea, so it will get snapped up and digested by the rumen bacteria very, very, very quickly. And so it's not like that you will feed urea and the cow actually benefits that much from it, the urea herself. The rumen bugs do. Soybean meal, clearly the king of all protein feeding. So as you do assignments, and I will emphasize this very clearly, obviously, if you are starting to think about feeding protein, you say, I need a protein supplement feed, soybean meal should be your number one option. It's the most commonly used one, and most of the time it comes in 48% crude protein concentration, but you can get it in 44, and the difference is how many soy hulls are in there. It's about 71 to 80% TDN, so on paper here it looks like it compares with corn. But remember, it's going to cost, instead of maybe 6 cents a pound for corn, you're going to be talking 25 cents a pound for soybean meal. So you don't want to feed soybean meal in order to replace corn. Soybean meal, very low in fiber and a very broad amino acid profile. That's why, besides cost, it's the number one out there. You say, what other forms? You can feed soy cake, pelleted. There's a number of other forms out there. You could also, not soybean meal, but you could also just take soybeans and simply roast them, but you don't find that very much anymore. That used to be more common. Animal and marine protein supplements, we're talking about meat, poultry, packing, rendering, marine industry, surplus milk, all of those types of things. We get down and give you some examples, like blood meal is 80% or more crude protein. So you would think, wow, I could feed just a little dab of blood meal and get a lot more bang for my buck than feeding soybean meal. Remember, it's got a very different amino acid profile, and it's very, very highly unpalatable. So those of you who don't like to eat broccoli, that think about trying to force feed you broccoli, your cows out there don't prefer to eat blood meal if they had their choice. So you can only feed a little bit, and generally you have to hide it in the ration a little bit. But it is important because it does provide a different amino acid profile that does raise milk production, it does raise efficiency, and it does make your ration more environmental. Fish meal, and the difference, why is such a huge range in crude protein content? That depends on the amount of bone and scale that's in the fish meal itself versus meat content. Very excellent protein quality and a lot of vitamin content in your fish meal. So you'll find that periodically, and you can almost always tell if you have a processed feed that's high in fish meal because you can smell it. Next is whey protein, byproduct of the cheese making business. We separate that whey off there. Very low actually in crude protein concentrate. That's why it barely makes the cut here in animal proteinaceous supplements, but it's used in milk replacers, pig starter diets, baby pigs. I talked about that earlier. Very, very, very palatable. It's very sweet tasting, gives you the milk taste, and producers or feed processors lots of times will spray on whey protein over the top of their pellets, sometimes to, number one, make the pellets stick together, and number two, make them taste good. The next one you see, I'm not mistaken here, in animal waste, and I'm primarily talking about poultry waste here, or poultry feed, or poultry feces. You can take that product and flash dry it and actually feed it back to ruminant diets. It's very, very high in urea. It's pretty effective in certain diets in certain ways, and if you flash dry it like we say, you don't have the risk of any disease transmission or anything like that. It does not sound probably like the one that many of you will pick, but in certain places that's a product that's available, again, that you might be able to replace a more expensive feed in your diet and be more efficient. Moving to the next slide and talk about some byproducts like of the corn industry. Corn gluten meal is available out there. It's a high protein feed, about 46 to 60% dried residue there when you remove some of the products out of corn, depending on what processing it's going through. Corn gluten feed, a little bit lower in protein because it contains the bran. So that one might be another one that you make. Distillers' dried grains, when you talk about byproducts of the alcohol brewing industry, or even the ethanol brewing industry. DDGs have become very, very, very common in terms of feeds and feed options because they're available generally pretty price competitive. Understand that there are differences in quality, and sometimes they can be processed to the extent that they are very, very highly undigestible. So you might have a much lower fraction of that percentage that's listed here on the slide that's actually digestible, depending on what plant it comes from and how accurate they are on how they process that ethanol or alcohol brewing process. Distiller's wet grains or brewer's grain. Also kind of here again, sometimes, especially if you get wet feeds, plan to be able to feed them quickly. Like Anheuser-Busch is a great resource for brewer's grain here in southern Illinois, but again, plan to be able to use that product quickly so it does not go out of condition. Wheat byproducts or wheat mids are in here. Certainly byproduct of the bread making business, and again, might be about 16 to 18% crude protein. Again, more commonly in swine diets, but I will say of wheat, it's gained a lot of favor in ruminant feeding because it will be price competitive, and we figured out how to process it and make it economical. Soybean hulls, probably one of my favorite feeds that fit kind of depending on price in here, pretty high in energy, pretty comparable to oats and crude protein. And provides a really nice fiber profile and generally extremely palatable. When you talk about soybean hulls, the skin right off the soybean, that's what we're referring to here, that comes off. You can take that and feed that right to your animals, and if it's price competitive, might be a good option to consider, a good example. Roughage feedstuffs characteristics, again, we kind of list a few of them here depending on soil. What you're going to get for mineral content, always higher in fiber, depending on what you're feeding it to. If you're talking about a beef finishing diet, we may not go very high on roughages, and clearly in a swine ration, it's not probably very economical for us to try and be feeding alfalfa hay to our finishing pigs, so you're not going to find that in there. But when you refer to dairy cattle, sheep, goats, it's going to be the primary feed stuff in order to maintain rumen health, maintain milk production, maintain cow health, etc. So proteinaceous roughages, and the king of all of those is alfalfa. Very hardy, extensive root system, and depending on when you mow hay is going to dictate where you are in that range of crude protein. If you let that alfalfa hay go to bloom and get all those purple flowers out there, you're going to be at that 15% crude protein. If you're out there mowing it at bud stage, you may early bud stage, you're going to hit that 21, 22, maybe up even to 25% crude protein. Higher than 50% TDN, but you don't feed it for energy. You're feeding it for a number of other reasons. Pretty high in calcium and ferrophosphorus profile, 2 to 5 cuttings per year. And the difference is how often you mow hay. Again, if you let it mature longer, you're going to get less cuttings per year. If you cut it more often, you're going to get more cuttings, maybe less tonnage, but higher quality. Again, as a manager's choice, and we'll discuss that in more detail in discussion in class. Carbonaceous roughage is generally less than 10% crude protein, and here we're talking about something like switchgrass. Then we can get into cruel season perennial grass forages. As you guys start talking about pasture grass and pasture grass blends and how we might feed animals, just supporting them out there on pasture. You need good blends of grasses that will be productive early in the spring, will handle the foot traffic. Orchard grass is a good example of one of, and talk about it being a pretty rapid developer. Works really good as partners with other different grasses and alfalfa. Pretty highly palatable. Timothy, another one that is nice in pasture. It doesn't handle some of the heat that we have in southern Illinois, so if you make good Timothy hay, you make it early in the season, because after it gets past bloom stage, it's gonna get kind of tough, and it doesn't handle the heat, so it oftentimes doesn't come back whenever our southern Illinois summers warm up. Small grains like wheat, again, somewhat effective in pasture. Barley and oats and stuff like that. Harvesting at silage, you want to hit boot stage so that the head is emerged and the dough is in the grain, and you want to probably get that chopper out if you're going to harvest it around then, and it will almost act just like corn silage. So a good option to silage acres. Which leads us to the most popular silage out there, which is corn silage, and the most palatable one. Moderate to very high in energy, depending on corn content, depending on the year that we have growing corn. Very low in protein. Again, we're talking about 9, 10, 11% crude protein. I say may not be most efficient in a finishing diet, and I will quantify that or qualify that by saying I've seen a number of producers use it as a finishing feed. If you grind it fine enough, it will then act quite nice as a finishing feed for steers. But high grain content is very desirable to couple it with some good fiber profile. Corn stover or stocklage. Go out there. Some of you guys like to get the baler out and go follow the combine around. You could ensile that if it's got a little bit of moisture to it, or it's good for wintering cattle, and whatever's out there has actually some energy. For pasture, we've been kind of talking about that a little bit. But again, think about durability, longevity, how it handles foot traffic, how it handles mud. If you're going to make your pasture into paddocks, how can you stretch out your pasture from early spring through late fall? And what percentage of your diet, your animal's diet, is going to come from pasture? Really will make sure that you monitor that quality and growth. We talk about using paddocks or rotational grazing because it actually will improve the productivity of your pasture. It makes it much more economical, more cows per acre, reduces overgrazing of spots that your animals just like the taste of the grass in certain spots, or undergrazing of areas that your cows don't like the taste of that grass in that spot. Don't forget to mow. Keep the weeds contained, fertilize, use herbicides only if necessary. Again, don't spend a lot of money here if you don't have to. And then if you can avoid grazing in wet conditions, that really tears up your pasture. If you have muddy conditions out there, stomping that grass in the ground will really reduce your pasture quality over time. There's some guidelines there in terms of proper stocking rates, and we'll discuss that more. Special concerns when we talk about pasturing, poisonous plants that might be out there, things like black nightshade. You'll see a little bit of that. Poison hemlock is another one of those poisonous plants, but you don't find that very often in southern Illinois. Bloat risk if you have legumes in your pasture. I don't see very many pastures in this area that have a lot of alfalfa in them, so that's generally not a good idea to get cows out pastured on high legume um, pastures because they will bloat. And then nitrate poisoning when we have drought issues, and 2012 reminded us of that as a just a quick little slide on green chop, and that's a feed that you would just go out and chop and feed right away, or go cut it and feed it just like mowing your grass and then dumping it over the fence to your cattle or your horse. The advantages is it's usually pretty palatable. They'll eat quite a bit of it, and sometimes that's the most yield per acre. The disadvantage is you can't do it all year round here in Southern Illinois, so you can't count on that as a feed in your diet, in your animal's diet, and it's not very uniform in quality from day to day. It changes. So green chop, not used at point in time. We got to spend a couple slides here talking about hay making. Keep that hay 15% moisture or less. Now, I know some of you out there with balers today are making hay a little bit higher moisture content than that, approaching that 20%, and I'm sure you're putting preservatives on it. But the risks when you get wet hay is big hay fires, because hay will go spontaneous combustion, and that makes for big hot fires and a big problem. So the keys to haymaking, first thing that I say is know when you want to mow hay. Know what kind of yield you want, what kind of hay fits in your feeding program, what kind of nutritional profile that hay is going to have when you mow, and then set your calendar and go by that. It's because stage of maturity of when you mow is directly correlated to nutrition. Make sure allow for a sufficient curing time. If you're conditioning or crimping your hay as it goes through the mower, that may cut that cure time by 50%. Raking, be careful. If it's too dry, you're going to have leaf shatter everywhere. So as you guys get your rakes and your tedders out there, be careful, be mindful of your process. Don't just go do it because you always do it that way. Be mindful of what you're doing out there in order to not leave leaves in the field, because that's good quality stuff that you're not going to be able to bale up. Baling in squares, the big squares that you see today, you got to get them stored or covered ASAP because they will not handle the weather, and round bales will. That's the advantage of them, because they shed water much easier. So some common losses out there. You talk about leaf shatter, and lots of my guys over the years that make hay are surprised that sometimes we have 40 to 75% leaf loss out there. 20% is normal, but there's a lot of times where we're leaving half of the leaves that provide the majority of the protein. We're leaving them in the field. So whenever you see guys out there baling and the dust is just flying, that's probably leaves flying away out there, and we let it get a little bit maybe too dry. Heat damage on the other end, you got to be careful of it. Hay hopefully doesn't get warmer than about 85 degrees. At about 120 degrees, we start to have some nutrient loss, and I'm primarily referring to protein there. And at 160 degrees, we call the fire truck because we're going to have spontaneous combustion. So again, be mindful when we talk about making hay. Fermentation losses shouldn't be much, and it shouldn't have much in terms of bleaching if you've done everything that we talked about in the previous few slides carefully, but losses under normal conditions are listed there at the bottom of the slide. Some additives are out there and have become much more common and much more effective, and I don't list any products here, but those preservatives are much more effective in today's baling systems, and actually widens your baling window a little bit, your harvest window. So I would recommend, carefully consider with these folks out here, the good people out here that give you good recommendations. Make sure that you pick a product that will help you. There's drying agents also available, and anhydrous ammonia, I list that mostly for historical reference. There's people that have actually gotten anhydrous and gassed their hay or gassed their corn silage in order to try and increase crude protein content. I wouldn't recommend that. I think that's wasted money. I think there are ways to improve your feed in other forms without having to invest in something like that. Plus the difficulty of Silages, remember that they always go through a fermentation phase and you have to have anaerobic conditions. The types of silos are listed there. The uprights, the airtights would be like your harvest stores out there. The semi-airtights like the regular concrete or stave silos. Horizontal silo storage facilities are listed there as well. Bottom line, it doesn't matter to me which one you pick. The most important thing is get the air out of the feed as fast as possible, because the sooner that there is no oxygen in the feed, the better it will ferment, the more consistent it will ferment, and the better quality feed. In the silo, as you chop that corn silage, those plants continue to respire for a little while and consume what oxygen is left, making carbon dioxide. You don't get mold because there's no oxygen if you've done this properly. The temperature normally should do much like what we talked about just with hay. It should increase to 80 or 100 degrees there in the first few days and then stabilize in that range. If you get above 100 to 120 degrees, you're going to have the caramelization, that Maillard reaction that we referred to back in the first section. And those the corn kernels that come out are going to look brown and burnt. That's not good, and your corn silage are going to come back and test poorly. Fermentation, acetic acid rises first and drives that pH from a normal of just over 6 to right above 4, and that happens in the first 4 days if you have ensiled your feed properly. That is critical. Making feed fast has become very, very popular, and for a good reason, because that feed lasts as well as possible and ferment it, make good quality. Lactic acid then begins on about day 3, lasts about 2 weeks, and is the most abundant acid, and it will stabilize the pH at about 4. So most of your corn silage out there that's ensiled has, if you tested it, would have a very acidic pH, much more so than you think. One of the ones that you don't want to find is butyric acid, and that's if you have insufficient packing procedures and way too much moisture in your feed. Very, very putrid smell. We'll discuss that in class, but that's an acid that you should not find. In propionic acid, there's very little present. But properly storing your feed is really crucial. And we'll say most of the time it takes 3 weeks to properly ferment an ensiled feed. But more and more extension and university research says let that feed sit 2 or 3 months so that it can completely finish any fermentation that's going on and make a nice stable feed. So plan in your feed budget for 15 months of feed out there if you can make that much feed at a time. And properly fermented corn silage, for example, lasts several years if you store it. We talked about a number of feeds that might be used, whether it's corn or legumes. Silage feeding, is advantageous because you can get pretty good quality feed and usually pretty high yield on a per acre basis. Disadvantages of feed and silages is once you make it, you got to feed it. There's really not a market out there. If you have corn silage and you decide you don't want to feed it, there's really not a marketplace to go sell it. So it's difficult, and plus people don't like to buy water if they don't have to, so it gets considerably costly if you have forage is made that then you can't feed. So make good quality forage, and I've got some guidelines here: 50 to 70% moisture range target, and what happens if it's too wet or too dry. That in class. Proper stage of maturity, we'll talk more specifically in class and discussion about when we should chop corn, when we should chop alfalfa. And I'll show you some videos when we get to the discussion section on how to properly pack your silages. When we talk upright silos, you just use gravity as your friend. That's the one that does it. Anything else, you have to apply pressure in some form or fashion. The bagger is packed by pressure. Anything a pile or a bunker or a pit is by tractor weight. And so anything that you can do to make it as heavy as possible is and think about the opposite things that we think about with causing compaction in the field in order to properly pack your pit silos, your bunkers, or your piles. Losses from ensiling poorly ensiled feeds or poorly managed or poorly covered feeds, we can be talking about throwing away as much as a quarter of your feed, and that's just unacceptable in terms of managing. Gang out there, get the plastic covered on those silos. Somehow make sure and maintain that quality out there. You've invested a lot of money to get that feed made. Don't get lazy on the back end and then not take care of it, because we can lose. And I've seen lots of producers that have to put 25% of their feed in a manure spreader and haul it to the field because they can't feed it. It's just rotten. There's some additives again out there that provide some good quality options. Increase your harvest window may give you a few advantages when feeding. So investigate those. I'm not going to endorse any products. You got to decide as a man there for you. And siling versus haymaking, you just have to decide. Wider harvest window, more yield per acre versus maybe more expensive machinery, fermentation problems. What do you have for storage? That's something that you as a manager or you as a consultant out there need to help producers make the decision. Should I make silage? Some common nutrient additives are listed here: microminerals, some trace minerals I've listed, and we've kind of talked about that. We're kind of circling back around. Vitamins, we've hit on those just a little bit, so I'm not going to spend too much time here. You guys can download the notes again and certainly re-listen to the PowerPoint on some of those situations where we talked about vitamins, fat soluble vitamins, and where they might be found in some of the feeds that you're making. So I'm going to skip through a couple of these here rather quick. Uh, Processing here. Why process? Again, understand we got to improve feed efficiency and make it as efficient as possible in our feeds out there. The margins are just so tight. So we're talking about grinding, pelleting, whatever it might be, in order to increase efficiency, make it easier to handle, make it more digestible, things of that nature. And we'll discuss this in more methods out there. Simple grinding of the hammer mill, and it is exactly as it sounds, just a big wheel of slinging metal hammers that beat whether most often corn into powder or ground corn like you might see. There's also a burr mill, which is basically two plates with some burrs on it sliding back and forth, and that's it probably works better for just cracking corn, but it really doesn't uniformly grind. Most all feed mills out there will have a hammer mill. Some might have a burr mill. Degrees of fineness is really, really important. You're going to find some old data here on these next couple slides in terms of degrees of fineness. 650 microns. We're talking about approaching powder. When you talk about swine diets with corn ground that fine, dairy on the subsequent slide here is around 1200 microns, which would be not quite cracked corn, but I tell you, today we ground dairy feed just almost like we grind pig feed, and same thing with beef feed. We figured out that it's much more effective, it's much more efficient, and we can make sure and provide enough fiber with other products to not cause health problems, and we'll discuss that. Pelleting is such an important piece of the industry in terms of feeding, because there are certain feeds that you just can't feed unless you pellet, reduce the dust, make more. You make your feed more digestible, much higher feed. It does make your feed more expensive though. So pelleting is something that you got to think about a little bit, because it can provide some options for you, but you have to think about whether it's worth. some information here on where it might be successful. You see a lot of creep feeds, whether it's horse diets or beef diets, that it is very, very helpful in pelleting. You'll get higher feed consumption rates. Dairy sometimes on only certain sections of the industry. But again, consider carefully whether you're a nutrition consultant or a farm manager out there, whether you should be using pelleting or pelleted feeds. Heat treating like steam rolling or steam flaking is also important. Anytime, same thing with the pelleting process. When we add heat and steam to feeds, you actually somewhat begin the digestion process for it. So you will actually make the feed much more digestible. 5 to 15% is what we've quoted, but that includes things like steam flaking or roasting, like what's listed here. Kind of makes the starch into a little bit of a gelatin, which makes your feeds much more digestible. Very common in your calf starters, for example, and you'll find it in some of your horse feeds and so forth. Makes for oftentimes a very sweet smell feed. High moisture grains, and I'm probably primarily talking about corn here. Basically, shelling corn at 20 to 35% moisture, run it through a grinder, and then storing it in some kind of silo, letting it ferment. It is very, very palatable, so you see feed efficiencies go up to about 8%. Now, why do you not see maybe everybody use this? It's because you got to have a place to store it on the farm, and if you don't store it well, it does go out of condition. That's why you find a lot of producers say, I'm not gonna mess with that. I'll have dry corn in the bin and use that for grinding, or buy corn at the mixing methods. There's basically two types of mixers, and when we get to discussion, we can talk more specifically about these. But a vertical mixer has some augers inside of it that does a nice job of basically mixing feed in a vertical fashion at the feed mill. If you want a lot of molasses in your feed, you can't do that very well in a vertical mixer. Generally, those vertical mixers are 3-ton batch sizes, so your feed mills are making feed kind of 3 tons at a time and processing it that way. If you're purchasing a whole semi-load at a time, then you know that they're going to make 8 batches of feed through that vertical mixer. A horizontal mixer is just think about a big rolling drum that you dump your ingredients in, and it has an auger in the middle and paddles on the inside of it, and it just rolls just like a drum, and actually handles high molasses feeds quite a lot better. And a lot of your higher molasses horse feeds are processed in that form. So your feed mill takes a lot of these things into account, and to think about what kind of order that they mix their feeds on a daily basis. And feed sequencing is quite critical, so that you make feeds in an order that's efficient for the feed mill, so that it's delivered to the customer on time. Plus, for example, you have feeds that have medication in them, like a baby pig feed, that then you cannot have that same antibiotic go into a dairy cow feed. So your feed companies out there have to think very carefully about their daily schedule when they make feed. So if I can provide a little bit of piece of advice to those of you who order feed out there on a bulk basis, is make sure that you give your company time to schedule to order your feed. Don't go out there and say, I'm out of feed and I need it delivered in about 3 hours so I can feed my cows, because it makes a lot of stress for the feed mill in order to fit that in, and much more chance for error, because we simply cannot have antibiotic residue in any feeds for animals that are going for slaughter or making milk, or you can't have certain things that might cause other animals' health issues. So make sure, again, when that feed gets delivered, that it's stored very carefully. Keep it void of insect problems and rodents. Mice and rats love feed that's laying around, and birds, obviously. So keep it clean and stored properly at proper moisture levels. Otherwise, you're going to end up throwing a lot. Things that affect feed intake: water availability, taste or palatability, like we've talked, energy level, age and size of animal, how hot it is outside, and then to the animal. About the last slide that we get to, and this is a slide, folks, that we will come back to again and again and again, because this will begin the basis of how to start building rations. Animals eat feed as a percent of body weight. So, for example, swine eat about 4 to 5% of their body weight. So, if you have a 100-pound pig out there, he eats about 4 to 5%, or 4 to 5 pounds of feed a day. Steers out there, again, 1,000-pound steer is going to eat 20 to 30 pounds of feed, and we're talking dry matter feed here. So those are your guidelines as we start to build rations. Generally, all your animals eat a percent of body weight. Now, you say, I have dogs listed down here at 2 to 3%. Dogs usually eat to their energy intake need. You say, well, why do dogs get fat? Well, they, just like you and I, can't keep up their energy level sometime and burn as much of it off. So that's why sometimes dogs have trouble controlling their weight, so to speak. But we will come back to this slide. This would be a slide that I would highlight whatever you do in order to make sure that you know where it's at, because we're going to refer back to this a number of times as now we start to build rations in subsequent sessions on what's going to happen with each of these species. I'll say, well, how much feed is she going to eat a day based upon this body weight? And you're going to have to come back and calculate, and this is the slide that will help you do that. So some take-home messages as we wrap up this section. Again, understand clearly what feeding products are available and why you should be using them. Don't feed feeds for the wrong reason. Recognize different options in processing, milling, storage, byproduct feeds, what's available. How might you cheapen your diet? How might you make it more effective and efficient? And lastly, familiarize yourself with things that will regulate feed intake. Like fiber, like health profiles, like how you present the feed, how it's processed, how it's stored, stuff like that. Make sure that you become good managers, or become adept at helping managers be effective at taking care of the feeds that they decide to purchase and put in their feeding program in order to maximize productivity. Thanks for listening in here on Unit 3. I hope we'll have good, robust discussion when we get to class, and we'll talk to you soon.